Hello everyone, welcome to Dungeons & Dragons with Dan, a YouTube series where we talk about improving your game of D&D with actionable advice and stories from history. Today we're going to be talking about my top 5 tips to make combat more exciting. Tip number 1, give enemies goals beyond killing the player characters. Tip number 2, enemies are smart and want to win. Tip number 3, add impactful terrain. Tip number 4, make combat an opportunity for role-playing. And my final tip, all combats need a reason to exist. Now we'll go in depth into each of these. Tip number 1 is give enemies goals beyond just simply killing the player characters. Karl von Clausewitz was a Prussian general who said that war is a continuation of politics by other means. In simpler terms, if people can't get what they want through diplomacy, they'll use force. People fight each other because they each have opposite and conflicting goals. Let's imagine that the player characters are being paid to protect a merchant caravan while it travels to a nearby city. But bandits are also trying to rob that same caravan. Both goals are in direct conflict with each other. Combat is what resolves this dramatic tension between the two groups. These goals should affect how the enemies try to win. I use quotations because the idea of winning can look very different than simply killing the other group. Let's take a second scenario, where players are attacking an evil king's keep that has 2 sentries guarding it. Those 2 guards are a trivial issue for most adventurers in combat. However, in this scenario, the guards might try to flee towards the keep or warn others that the adventurers are here with an alarm. The goal of the guards is to warn others while the players are trying to stop them. Here's a few more ideas. Cultists are trying to summon a demon before the player characters can stop them. Bodyguards are trying to prevent the players from chasing an escaping villain, or pirates are trying to sink the adventurer's ship. Adding different goals allows for multiple fail states between victory and total party kill. Additionally, using this tip allows the DM to challenge their players with more than just more bad guys or worse and stronger bad guys. Tip number 2, enemies are smart and want to win. Their tactics are going to be determined by their culture, training, and even personality. Goblins fight differently than zombies, which fight differently than dragons. I don't think we give goblins enough credit as bad guys. They're almost a joke for any party past level 3, yet these creatures seem to be the plague of many small towns. Why is that? Well, they're sneaky and vicious. Goblins are the type of monsters to set up traps inside their own homes, keep rabid wolves as pets, and conduct surprise attacks when they have a numbers advantage. Goblins will try to surround the party and focus fire against soft targets like a wizard or bard. Moreover, goblins might climb up trees or spend their turns running away to hide behind a bush after they've shot their bows. Intelligent creatures recognize their mortality. Are they willing to die for their goals established back in tip 1? A kobold might die for the wormling they worship, but will a goblin die for the hobgoblin they follow out of fear? Here's a brief story from history. In the first Gulf War, the Iraqi army had nearly 1 million troops. However, a large majority of these were Shia conscripts being led by an oppressive Sunni dictator, Saddam Hussein. Almost 200,000 of these Iraqi troops deserted in the first 5 weeks of US bombings. How do people in your campaign see their boss? Of course, there are exceptions to this rule with brainless undead. Zombies and skeletons might mindlessly walk into player-placed traps or trip on hazardous terrain. Low intelligence creatures' weaknesses can be just as interesting as smart creatures' strengths. Allow player characters to exploit enemies' weaknesses in creative ways. Speaking of terrain, let's go on to tip number 3. Tip number 3 is add more impactful terrain. How often do your combats have terrain that make a real impact on player or creature decisions? This is really on the DM to initiate because a lot of players won't realize it's possible unless the DM does it first. Have a goblin archer climb up a tree and your players will realize that combat is more complicated than simply moving and attacking. Have torches go out in a dark room, or enemies turn over tables and use them as cover. How about falling stalagmites? Imagine what items your bad guys have laying around. Add more than terrain that just gives cover or blocks movement. Add interactable things like cauldrons of hot soup that can be spilled, or an orb of silence, or rapidly growing fungus that grapples the players. Liches, dragons, and beholders all have lair actions, but you can try to scale these down and create unique ones based on the creatures they're fighting against. Tip number 4, make combat an opportunity for role-playing. Critical Role popularized the phrase, "how do you want to do it?" which was when Matt Mercer would ask his players to describe how they killed an enemy. If your combat is simple as saying, "I roll X, okay, you miss," then you're missing out on an awesome opportunity to roleplay. Use the dice rolls as input on how you describe the fighting. Don't let the rolls replace your storytelling. Invite your players to add more role-playing in your combat by doing it yourself as the GM. Let's pretend an orc is attacking a player character fighter. Instead of saying, "the orc rages, moves 30 feet to you, and attacks." 17, so it misses. Say the orc turns to you, snarls, and his eyes turn a deep red as he stares at you. He runs across the room and swings at you, but it deflects off your armor. Now you've described how the orc acts and made combat more narrative, focusing on the story rather than the numbers being rolled. I don't think you need to narrate every fight, since that can get pretty lengthy quickly. However, sprinkling in key moments and special abilities will help the players see conflict as an unfolding story rather than a series of dice rolls. Tip number 5, all combats need a reason to exist. There's a lot of the stuff as DMs that we kind of hand wave away and kind of forget about because they aren't interesting to talk about or role-playing. D&D is a role-playing game, not a life simulator. Don't waste an hour throwing encounters at the players for the sake of it. This goes back to tip number 1, where all the enemies should have a goal that adds tension to your game. Is the encounter introducing a villain? Maybe challenging the players with a unique problem set, or teaching them about your world? If not, consider just removing it. If you have 5 combats inside a goblin cave, 50 combats is certainly not 10 times better. Of course, if your players are new, there's some value in using encounters to help them learn their characters and their abilities. But honestly, ask yourself, does this encounter add anything to the story or present an interesting and unique challenge? If not, then just think about cutting it. Focus on quality encounters rather than quantity. So we talked about 5 different tips. Number 1, give enemies goals beyond killing player characters. Tip number 2, enemies are smart and want to win. Tip number 3, add impactful terrain. Tip number 4, make combat an opportunity for role-playing. And finally, tip number 5, all combats need a reason to exist. Thank you for coming to Dungeons & Dragons with Dan. I hope you have a wonderful day.